Good evening, friends. In the talk given last month, as part of this series Observing the Divine Plan program, here at the Baha'i World Center, Mr. Shahryar Razavi shared with us some thoughts about this year's wristband message. In doing so, he took us through a historical overview of the development of the Baha'i community, particularly since 1996, when the Universal House of Justice set the Baha'i world on a path of intensive learning about the sustained rapid growth of the faith. As we have advanced in this path, our capacity as a community has gradually increased, enabling us to take on more and more challenges. It seems appropriate then that in this series of talks, we look to the future and examine together where we currently stand on this path of intensive learning and try to see where it is taking us. It is in this context that I want to explore with you tonight a few ideas related to our efforts to work for the betterment of the society and describe for you some of the emerging patterns of social action. I will do this by first placing our efforts to undertake social action in a historical context, reviewing some of the ideas that Shahryar Razavi presented last talk. I will then say a few words about our approach to social action, initially from a conceptual point of view, touching on matters related to approach and framework, and then from a practical point of view. This I will do in the context of an advanced cluster. Much of I will say will be based on my experience with Fundaec, a Baha'i-inspired NGO in Colombia that I have been associated with for many years now, and whose experience, of course, is most familiar to me. I'm sure that you are well familiar with the opening paragraph of this year's wristband message. In it, the Universal House of Justice provided us with a picture of the Baha'i community in action. It spoke of thousands upon thousands engaged in systematic study of the creative world, striving to apply what they have learned through a process of action, reflection, and consultation. It then described how these thousands upon thousands are carrying out acts of collective worship in diverse settings, and how they are entering into purposeful discussion on themes of spiritual import, are deepening their knowledge of the faith, are sharing Baha'u'llah's message, and are welcoming increasing numbers to join them in a mighty spiritual enterprise. The message went on to say that these thousands upon thousands are extending their efforts widely to involve ever-growing contingents of participants in classes for children and are assisting junior youth to become empowered to direct their energies towards the advancement of civilization. And the Universal House of Justice ended its description of the community with this important sentence: and with the advantage of a greater abundance of human resources, an increasing number of them are able to express their faith through a rising tide of endeavors that address the needs of humanity in both their spiritual and material dimensions. So somehow, through this process of action, reflection, consultation, combined with the study of the creative world, we have reached a level of community life that allows to maintain a continued healthy pattern of growth. And our human resources are now such that while maintaining the healthy pattern of growth, an increasing number of us can gradually expand the sphere of our activities to address both the material and the spiritual needs of humanity. For these expanded efforts to be fruitful, we need to think systematically about the nature of social action, to think about what it means for a Baha'i to be involved in social action. As we will see later, the term social action refers to a range of activities, from efforts to raise people's consciousness about certain issues, to individual efforts to apply the teachings to improve some aspect of life, to small, loosely organized local activities, to more formal projects of social and economic development, all the way to complex programs undertaken by Baha'i-inspired NGOs. And this is not to say, of course, that Baha'is have not been engaged in many forms of social action up to now. However, in some clusters, we are collectively reaching the important point where we can start to talk systematically about social action in the context of the plans we're making for the growth of the cluster, in a way that, as the House of Justice has stressed, will ensure that everything we do is coherent. What I think it is essential for us to recognize is that this is a natural next step in the process of learning in which we are engaged. In 1996, we started to systematically develop our human resources. We then began to deploy these human resources in clusters to carry out devotional meetings, children classes, and study circles. Our communities started to grow as we opened these activities to our neighbors, friends, and co-workers. As we extended these efforts, incorporated activities for junior youth, and employed direct teaching methods, we grew further and began to see the transformation of villages and neighborhoods. It is only natural, then, that we will draw further into the life of society and that the demands on us will increase. In fact, it is precisely what the House of Justice told us in the Read Band message. As you continue to labor in your clusters, it is stated, you will be drawn further and further into the life of society around you and will be challenged to extend the process of systematic learning in which you are engaged to encompass a growing range of human endeavors. What does this mean in practice? How do we integrate new endeavors into the activities central to the plan while maintaining the focus that was so hard to achieve? Does it mean that some will work for the progress of the plan and others will be doing something else? Is it an either-or situation? Clearly, this is not the case. A more reasonable answer comes when we see social action as another aspect of the culture of growth that is evolving. We are a community whose members pray together, visit one another, accompany one another in their acts of services, take care of their children and junior youth together. And above all, we are a community whose members are learning together what it means to apply the teachings of Baha'u'llah to our individual and collective lives. This is who we are and what we do. This is, we could say, the way of life of our community. And clearly, all of us are taking part in this community life. It is what we all do as part of our efforts to build a civilization conceived by Baha'u'llah. And as we gain in strength collectively, as our collective capacity increases, it is only natural that some of the capacity that we now have would be used to improve the life of society, to learn about how the teachings can be applied to areas such as health and education, agriculture, and the environment. So again, this is a natural extension of our current learning process. So some of us, in addition to those aspects of community life in which we currently take part, will now begin to address certain other kinds of needs and work in specific ways for the betterment of humanity. And this will eventually become another feature that distinguishes the Baha'i community. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, social action is not something new to the Baha'i community. Our involvement in the life of society dates back to the earliest days of the faith, and even in recent years, we have gained a great deal of experience with social and economic development and other forms of social action. But we will now be thinking about how social action fits into the work that we are undertaking in the specific context of the cluster. We are obviously not talking about all clusters, but those in the forefront on the learning process. That is, those that have well-established intensive programs of growth, where expansion and consolidation are proceeding hand in hand. And we are not talking about introducing complex development projects here, but a simple set of activities that contributes to the well-being of society and can grow in complexity as capacity increases. So the question is, what does it mean to take some form of social action in developing the localities in a well-advanced cluster? In trying to answer this question, we will draw on much of the experience we have already gained, but we will have to figure it out gradually, as we did with the question of expansion and consolidation. Remember what the Universal House of Justice said in the Read Band message. As you continue to labor in your clusters, you will be drawn further and further into the life of the society around you and will be challenged to extend the process of systematic learning in which you are engaged to encompass a growing range of human endeavors. And then it said, in the approaches you take, the methods you adopt, and the instruments you employ, you will need to achieve the same degree of coherence that characterizes the pattern of growth presently underway. The approach, then, that has helped us most in achieving coherence is that of action, reflection, and consultation undertaken in light of the guidance of the writings. We will certainly use the same approach, then, as we begin to think about working for the betterment of society in a cluster. We will carry out some action, we will reflect and consult on the results, and study the guidance in the writings, and adjust our action in light of the experience. As we do this, our efforts to influence those different areas of human endeavors with the teachings of the faith will become more and more effective. So our approach, that is, the way we go about learning how to apply the teachings to different fields of human endeavors, will be one of action, reflection, and consultation. We, of course, will carry out this process of action, reflection, and consultation within a framework. Having a framework has been critical to the coherence that distinguishes the way our Baha'i communities are growing in a cluster. All the different things we do fit together and not fragmented from one another, because we are learning how to do them within a framework. Now, I'm not going to go into a long explanation of a framework for you. You have seen this word in various messages of the Universal House of Justice, and we don't need to define it here tonight. But what we should understand is that we all operate within a framework. That is, we all have certain beliefs, ideas, habits of thoughts, principles, values, and that define what we do and how we do things, and what we will not do. Many of these elements come from the holy writings of our faith and the guidance of the Universal House of Justice. And of course, we have a collective framework that defines how we do things as a community. It is this framework that has given coherence and continuity to the way we are growing as a Baha'i community. So for tonight, it is enough for us to acknowledge that in our efforts to engage with society, we will need to operate within the framework as well. For example, one of the elements of our framework, is that we believe that life has both material dimension and a spiritual dimension. The way we go about addressing the question of health, environment, or economics then will not be from a pure materialistic or physical point of view. It will take into account the spiritual dimension of human being. But we will also not address the question entirely from what we would say is a spiritual point of view. There will be a strong component of the physical sciences. I would like to say a few more words about this particular element of our framework as an example of how becoming conscious of the elements of our framework affects the nature of the activity that we undertake. Then we can begin to explore together the question of social action itself. But first, let me review what we have said up to now. We began our discussion tonight by looking at the opening paragraph of this year's Read Band message, in which the Universal House of Justice describes the activities of the Baha'i community worldwide. We focused particularly on the last sentences and noted that we have reached the point in our collective endeavors where, while maintaining a healthy pattern of growth as a community, some of us in advanced clusters can also begin to think about meeting the needs of the society around us. In trying to systematically incorporate social action into the work at the level of the cluster, we will draw on the rich experience we have already gained in interacting with society in various ways. But we will also need to learn how the teachings of the faith can be applied to the development of the towns and villages or neighborhoods in a cluster. Since there are no formulas for that, we will need to learn through a process in which we constantly make effort, reflecting on the results of our actions, consulting about experience, and studying the guidance in the writings. We will do all this within a conceptual framework that will ensure that this process of action, reflection, and consultation and study is not haphazard, that the various actions we take collectively are not fragmented from one another. This framework will ensure that we achieve coherence in what we do, that all our actions are consistent with one another, that they fit together well, that they are prioritized properly. A difficult word for me. Now, I would like to discuss in some detail one of the elements of this framework, as I mentioned before, that has a profound implication for our social action, our belief that life has both material and a spiritual dimension. As an abstract concept, we will all meditate on it in a lifetime of study and reflection. But it has a very practical implications, and it is this implication that we are interested in tonight. Let me begin by reading this quotation from the writings of Abdul Baha, which I'm sure you are all familiar with. And among the teachings of Baha'u'llah is that although material civilization is one of the means for the progress of the world of mankind, yet until it becomes combined with divine civilization, the desired result, which is the felicity of mankind, will not be attained. Material civilization is like a lamp glass. Divine civilization is the lamp itself, and the glass without the light is dark. Material civilization is like the body. No matter how infinitely graceful, elegant, and beautiful it may be, it is dead. Divine civilization is like the spirit, and the body gets its life from the spirit. Clearly, the fact that we do not believe that existence is solely material has many implications for us, both individually and collectively. It is the collective aspect that we want to explore this evening and see how it affects, as one of the elements of our framework, the way we go about taking social action and contributing to the welfare of society. In the world as it is today, materialism defines the nature of prosperity. Prosperity is thought of largely in economic terms, in terms of our material progress and the happiness derived from it. This does not mean that religion or spirituality has no role in people's lives, but in the fragmented world that we live, where work and leisure, family life and spiritual life, physical health and intellectual pursuits, and so on, are all pieces that together make up our existence, in such a world, matters related to religion and spirituality are either left to the individual or relegated to the realm of culture. Of course, in these recent years, we have seen a rise in the force of religion for use as a political instrument. But in any case, the process considered most central to social existence is economic activity. All other processes of social life are somehow subordinated to it. Education is a way to getting a job. Technology is defined in terms of economic gains. Think of transportation, for example. The leaders of a developing region may pass laws and set up infrastructure so that cars become the principal means of transportation rather than trains for pure economic considerations or groups' interests, believing this choice it is good for the region and will make it more prosperous. The effect of this choice on the environment is a secondary consideration at best. I think that one need only reflect for a moment on the effect of the environment of what we consider progress in order to see what it means for economic consideration to take precedence over all others. Maximizing profit, reducing cost, these become the basis for decision making. Man's relationship with the land, for example, gradually loses its importance. There is a powerful passage from Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath that I would like to read for you. The book tells the story of a group of tenant farmers in 1930 in America who are thrown off their land by a bank that they owe money to, and a large industrial farm is moving in. Referring to the tractor driver who has come to plow the fields for $3 a day, a good sum then, while the tenant farmers and their family watch helplessly, Steinbeck says, he could not see the land as it was. He could not smell the land as it smelled. His feet did not stamp the clods or feel the warmth or power of the earth. He sat in an iron seat and stepped on iron pedals. He did not know or own or trust or beseech the land. He loved the land no more than the bank loved the land. The land, Steinbeck writes, bore under iron, and under iron gradually died. For it was not loved or hated, it had no prayers or curses. And one of the tenant farmers watching nearby ponders this, and what he pondered is quite profound. He says, funny things how it is. If a man owns a little property, that property is him. It's part of him. And it's like him. If he owns property only so he can walk on it and handle it and be sad when it isn't doing well and feel fine when the rain falls on it, the property is him. And some way he's bigger because he owns it. Even if he isn't successful, he's big with his property. This is so. And then this tenant farmer thinks some more. But let a man get property he doesn't see, or can't take time to get his fingers in, or can't be there to walk on it. Why then the property is the man? He can't do what he wants. He can't think what he wants. The property is the man, stronger than he is. And he is small, not big. Only his possessions are big. And he is the servant of his property. That is so too. What I would like to ask you to think about this, with these comments in mind, is that oppression seems to be inherent in the materialistic framework. No matter how good intentions are, no matter how pure the motive of those planning and making decisions, the result seems to be a growing gap between the rich and the poor, between those that have and those that don't. Of course, it is not our purpose tonight to look at the causes of oppression. All I'm trying to do is to show how central the economic process is to social existence in our world today. Policies and infrastructure are put in place to drive this process above all others. Again, we are talking about broad social processes and not individuals and their attitudes and their concerns. Now, when we think about the civilization envisioned by Baha'u'llah, we know that it will be a prosperous one. Prosperous both materially and spiritually. Clearly, in such a civilization, the creation and distribution of wealth will have its proper place. But surely, economic activity will not be an end in itself. To build and maintain a civilization where the material and spiritual requirements of life work in harmony will require a vast amount of knowledge. The writings of our faith, of course, place great emphasis on the generation and application of knowledge, and it is this process, it seems to me, that should be placed at the heart of social existence. Again, our purpose tonight is not to think about knowledge, but to see how a conceptual framework that gives equal importance to the material and the spiritual affects the way we take social action. And what I'm basically saying is that in such a framework, with such a world view, the generation and application of knowledge can be seen as the central process propelling the advancement of civilization. The kind of knowledge that I'm talking about includes science with all its ramifications, and religion as a source of a spiritual understanding. This knowledge is concerned with the nature and working of both spiritual and material phenomena, the nature of the human being, the mysteries of the universe, and the principles that govern it, and covers a range of conceptual and practical issues as well. How to build solid and harmonious communities, how to establish justice, how to create balanced relationships between individuals and groups, how to educate individuals who are imbued with a sense of moral purpose, how to abolish the existing prejudices, how to appropriately use the world's natural resources, how to make best use of the land and develop and use technology that is appropriate, how to build social structures that are based on justice, how to produce and distribute goods and services equitably. In exploring these kinds of questions, we will need to draw on the learning that humanity has accumulated through our history about ways spiritual principles and scientific methods can be used in order to achieve material and spiritual progress. In this sense, modern science and its methods will clearly be the main source of knowledge. But we also have to look at the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of the peoples of the world and the way they go about solving their day-to-day problems. For example, in general, modern technology may allow us to maximize profits by reducing costs. But in many places in the world, when one of your neighbors needs a job, you may hire him to work on a farm, not because it maximizes your profit. In fact, it doesn't, but because that is what you should do. I remember once in Colombia, we were visiting some of the farmers, and we were trying to help people to make these farms more efficient. And then when we were discussing with them the income statement and to see how much money he has spent and that his costs were really high because he was hiring too much labor. And then we pointed out to him that. And then he said, yes, I understand that, but with his own rationality, he said, but my neighbor didn't have a job this week, and he has children to feed. So I had to hire him. So that's a different rationality. We came to realize that the social and economic structures of these farmers were not based solely on economic consideration, but on values like cooperation, reciprocity, and solidarity. So our challenge became how to integrate this into the programs we were developing. So often modern technology comes in and tries to change things in isolation from the social context. But the real challenge is to apply science and technology in a way that universal values are not a limitation, but become an advantage. How do you build social structures and design programs that accommodate such values? In this sense, we say that efforts to improve society should draw equally on science and religion. Religion being the shared heritage of human race that can provide insight into the deepest questions of human purpose and motivation. As Baha'is, of course, we look to the writings of the faith to find those principles and teachings that will enable humanity to progress in this day of days, to gradually realize the potentiality with which human existence has been endowed. The role that we assign to knowledge and its generation and application will greatly affect our efforts to contribute to the advancement of society. If knowledge is the force propelling the advancement of civilization, if that is the case, then participating in its generation and application is not only the right of every human being, but their obligation, for we all have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. That suggests that our approaches to social action have to be participatory in nature. They will not treat people like passive recipients of knowledge, that is, passive recipients of programs designed to improve their situation in life. Rather, our methods and approaches will engage people themselves in the generation, application, and diffusion of knowledge. This, then, is another element of our framework for action. What I think we should all realize is the fact that in the past 12 years, we have learned a great deal about the question of participation in the context of the cluster, in the context of the growth of the Baha'i community. And we have refined methods and approaches that will help us now in engaging more and more people in working for their own spiritual, social, and intellectual development, to engage them in a global discourse, a global conversation, if you will, about the advancement of a materially and spiritually prosperous civilization. Think about how much we have learned about eliciting greater and greater participation in such a global discourse about the growth of the Baha'i community. We know that we need structures in place at the different levels to channel learning generated from the grassroots to the regional level, to the national level, to the international level. We know that much of the knowledge generated will be diffused in programs of training. These training programs will develop human resources at different levels of competency that are dedicated to improving the well-being of their communities. We know that while some of these programs of training will be centralized, others will be offered through a system of distant education that reaches the grassroots of society. We know that efforts should begin with a simple set of activities in keeping with the capacity to sustain them and grow in scope and complexity as resources, human and otherwise, increase. Think of what a powerful thing we have accomplished by eliciting greater and greater participation of the believers in the growth of the Baha'i community all over the world through these means. We should not underestimate the value of what we have accomplished. we are beginning to see the power of the collective will to bring about change, to see what can be accomplished by a community when its members come together and set out with clarity of purpose to do something. Raising consciousness at the collective level has been an important aspect of releasing this power, and it proves to be important in the case of social action as well. With all this in mind, let's look at the question of social action. What do we actually mean by it? I have already mentioned that the term social action refers to a range of activities, from efforts to raise people's consciousness about certain social issues, to individual efforts to apply the teachings to improve some aspect of life, to small, loosely organized local activities, to more formal projects of social and economic development, all the way to complex programs undertaken by Baha'i-inspired NGO. It's a whole range of activities. We know that the civilization envisaged by Baha'u'llah will not be established on solely through efforts of the Baha'is. There are many others who are working toward promoting peace and fellowship throughout the world, and many more are looking for ways to contribute to improving the condition of society at large. Undoubtedly, we can learn from experiences of these individuals, as well as from various institutions that played an effective role in contributing to the transformation of society. We, in turn, can share with them the insights and motivating power of the revelation of Baha'u'llah to help them fulfill their goals: service for the common good, participation in social affairs, and cooperation with like-minded groups all provide opportunities for us to apply the spiritual and social teachings of the faith to the challenges facing society. At the simplest level, we can do this as individuals acting alone, in groups, or as communities, carrying out small projects, usually of a fixed duration, perhaps a day or a few weeks, that address some social issues. We often refer to these as the first stirrings at the grassroots, a natural resource of the heightened awareness of the needs of humanity that comes as Baha'i identity increases. Of course, Baha'is have been undertaking such social action for many years in the form of workshops and seminars, tree planting, sewing and clean up projects, and so on. But what we want to do now is to see how the question of social action is starting to manifest itself in advanced clusters at this simplest level, and how activities at a higher level of complexity are gradually being introduced into the work of such clusters. Because, of course, activities at the simplest level can only go so far in changing social condition, and more organized formal social process sustained over a long period of time are needed to make a significant impact. First of all, I think that we should explain that we are talking about only a small number of places in the Baha'i world that have reached this point, maybe 100 or so. Let us see what is starting to happen by taking an imaginary example. Let us say that our imaginary cluster, which is in a rural area, launched an intensive program of growth several years ago, and it is on its 9th or 10th cycle of activity. There is a total population of 3,000 Baha'is, of which 2,000 or so adults or youth over the age of 15. Of these, about 800 have entered the Institute programs, with 120 who have reached Book 7 and can act as tutors. These 800 or so represent the pool of human resources in the cluster. There are about 200 devotional meetings held with some degree of regularity. Baha'i children classes are well established, as are junior youth and study circles. Through all of its activities, the Baha'i community has developed an expanded network of contacts, parents of children and junior youth, family and friends of new believers. All these visited especially during the expansion phase and thought phase. Though such a pattern of action, there has been a steady flow of enrollments through such a pattern of action, the rate of enrollment has been about 70 to 120 by cycle. Reflection meetings are well attended, and given the complexity of managing such a large number of activities, there is a coordinator each for children classes, for junior youth groups, and for study circles, in addition to the area teaching committee and auxiliary board members serving the cluster. As you can imagine, there is a great deal of cohesion in the community and a strong sense of Baha'i identity. Maintaining such a high level of activity is not easy, but the Baha'is in the cluster are committed to doing so. This is not only imaginary cluster, some clusters are real, like this. Now, let us say that in the reflection meetings, the idea of taking some kind of social action emerges, of doing something that will influence the wider society as a whole and benefit it. Though there is a lot of discussion, the consultation is fairly focused because this has become a natural habit of the friends in the cluster. Several ideas emerge from the discussion. Someone brings up the subject of environment, mentioning the problem with the river that flows through the region that makes it unsafe for drinking. Another person argues that this is not a problem they can solve. It is too big. In the end, everyone agrees that the pollution in the river is part of the global problem with the environment, so they cannot fix it themselves. But it's important for them to try to understand the nature of the problem. Maybe they will find that there is something they can do to solve part of it. Then someone talks about how the region has changed in recent years as they have started to introduce some of the advantages of technology in their farming methods. Some families, he mentions, now have trouble meeting basic needs since they are no longer growing their own food on small plots of land. As they discuss this, they realize how much the families used to share their produce among themselves before, and how this made sure that everyone had what they needed. Everyone agrees that if they are creative, they can probably organize themselves so that they can at least solve part of the problem. Then someone raised the question of education and said that they think their children are at a disadvantage because they do not have access to preschool education. No one is sure how they could do anything about it. Some of them have learned that several communities in an advanced cluster in a nearby country have started their own preschools after a few of their young people receiving training to become teachers by a Baha'i-inspired NGO. Everyone agrees that this is a good thing to do. As they continue to discuss possibilities, they begin to see that there are all kinds of different needs and problems, but at different levels of complexity. They realize that they should not overextend themselves and get distracted in some complicated projects. Still, there is excitement as they consider the possibilities. They want to take some small action that they can do with their own resources that will involve many of them and that will have some impact on the society around them. It has become clear to them that they can use their power as a community to do something, even if only small. They have become more aware not only of the nature of some of their problems and needs, but also of their many advantages. They have shared values. They can organize themselves. They have the power of their collective will. In the end, they return to the question of the decrease in food production. They discuss further the loss of many species of plants in the region and their dependence on a couple of commercial crops, which has put them at the mercy of the market. And then they take a very simple but important first step. They decide to make a long list of all the fruit trees that had been lost to the region and ask each family present to plant one of the species in order to bring variety back to the diet. At first, only the families present will participate in the project, but later they will talk to other families and their friends in order to involve an increasing number of people in the effort. Everyone is feeling galvanized, and they all agree that this is something they can do and still keep themselves focused on the goals that they have set for the expansion and consolidation of the faith during the next cycle of activity. Now, the tree planting project may sound like a simple thing, and it is in reality. But we should not underestimate how effective such a first step can be in involving the Baha'is in the life of society, and how much Baha'is can begin to distinguish themselves as a community in that way. Let us look at the project a little further. It emerged out of a consultative process within the community and is well within the capacity of their members to undertake. It is, in a sense, individual action done collectively, of course. It requires the effort of every Baha'i family in our cluster. But as I mentioned before, more complex kinds of social action need to be undertaken to really begin to transform society. So let us take the story further. Let us say that at the next reflection meeting in the cluster, a small group of youth had been asked to give a presentation on the environment so that the community can better understand some of the causes for the pollution in the river. The youth are 14, 15 years old and are studying an educational program that includes a course on environmental issues. So they are all well prepared. They talk about the different activities that the people in the region carry out in order to have their daily lives and to achieve progress. In this way, the friends at the reflection meetings begin to think about the effect of human activity on the physical environment. They all realize that this does not mean that human activity should be brought to an end, but that health of the environment and the pursuit of prosperity need to be considered together. As a result of the discussion, they decide to host a series of public talks to raise awareness about environmental issues and ask the group of youth to make all the preparations. Like the tree planting project, this activity is still a fairly simple endeavor. We could say that is the result of the heightened awareness of the members of the community on this particular social issue, an awareness that has given rise to some social action against at the simplest level. Now, it so happens that there is a non-governmental organization in the region, which was established a few years ago by several Baha'is who, inspired by the teachings of the faith, wanted to give some youth access to a good education. This Baha'i-inspired NGO is now trying to train 20 young people, all high school graduates between the ages 18 and 25, in how to run a formal secondary educational program at the local level. As part of their training, each of these young people has established a small group of students, 14, 15 years old, in their own village and town. Among these 20 is a young woman who lives in the town where all reflection meetings were held. This young woman, in addition to acting as a tutor of study circles, is also working with a group of 7 students in the town, taking them through a series of units that address language, mathematics, science, and technology, as well as service to the community. And it was her students who actually gave the presentation at the reflection meeting as one of the practices associated with the unit they are studying, called environmental issues. The unit is helping these 14 and 15 years old to learn how to raise consciousness in their communities about the effect of human activity on the environment. As we can see, what this Baha'i-inspired NGO is doing is much more complex endeavor than the one undertaken by the community. It involves an entire secondary education program with its many facets and a great deal of institutional capacity in the part of the NGO. Now, this is what we call social and economic development, another kind of social action, a particular type of social action, highly organized, in which activities or projects are created that can evolve and grow over time to address a particular problem facing the community. The purpose of social and economic activities is a sincere and disinterested service to humanity. Baha'is do not proselytize, and development projects are not conducted for the purpose of public relations or as means of converting people. They are driven by an overarching sense of service to the humanity. In the Baha'i communities, in an advanced cluster, are going to go beyond the simplest form. These communities are going to go beyond the simplest acts of social action. Every country or region will need to be endowed with institutional capacity to offer training programs in areas such as health, education, and others, and to conduct projects of social and economic development. NGOs like the one serving in our imaginary cluster will gradually need to be established in every country and will need to develop such capacity. This, of course, is one of the concerns of the Office of Social and Economic Development in the World Center. Through various means, OSER is helping to strengthen the institutional capacity of Baha'i-inspired organizations in regions and countries throughout the world. It is also helping to systematize and diffuse the learning of the Baha'i communities worldwide in addressing different areas of activity. As we think about all this, then, we begin to catch a glimpse of a very exciting kind of system that is put in place. A system where there is an increasing amount of activity in different areas of action at the grassroots, where there are numerous Baha'i-inspired organizations and the regional and national levels developing human resources to stimulate this activity at the grassroots and carrying out projects for the betterment of society, and where all the learning generated is being systematized and diffused at the international level by OSET. This is indeed quite an exciting picture. Not all of us, clearly, will be involved in the work of social and economic development. And not all Baha'is live in clusters where the friends can begin to think about social action. Hopefully, more and more clusters will soon reach that stage. But for all of us, no matter what path in life we have chosen, service is most central to our existence. Let me end tonight's talk then with some words of Abdul Baha. He says, "Every imperfect soul is self-centered and thinketh only in his own good. But as his thoughts expand a little, he will begin to think of the welfare and comfort of his family. If his ideas still more widen, his concern will be the felicity of his fellow citizens. And if still they widen, he will be thinking of the glory of his land and of his race. But when ideas and views reach the utmost degree of expansion and attain the stage of perfection, then will he be interested in the exaltation of humankind. He will then be the well-wisher of all men and the seeker of the will and prosperity of all lands. This is indicative of perfection."